It is 10 o'clock on the night of March 22nd, 1945. The Rhine River rolls through the dark at 3 knots, cold and black, indifferent to what is about to happen on its banks. The vineyards on the western shore are still. A few miles away, German soldiers in threadbare uniforms are huddled around fires, waiting for a war they know they're losing to either find them or end. Nobody in Berlin is watching this particular stretch of river tonight. Nobody has been assigned to watch it, because according to every calculation German High Command has made, nothing is going to happen here. They are about to be catastrophically wrong. Down at the waterline, American soldiers are carrying assault boats toward the river, not driving them, carrying them by hand over muddy fields in absolute silence. No engine noise, no artillery, no air cover rolling in to soften up the eastern bank. Not a single shell has been fired. These men have been whispering for hours, passing orders lip to ear down lines that stretch back through the dark orchards and closed farm roads. Many of them have crossed rivers already, the Moselle, the Saar, the Sauer, and they know the feeling of getting into a small boat and pushing off into a current, while someone on the other side might be about to start shooting. Tonight, nobody is shooting. The boats slip into the water. The first paddles go in quietly. The Rhine takes the bow, tugs, and the boats swing with the current as the men compensate. Within 30 minutes, the lead elements of the United States Third Army are halfway across Hitler's most sacred river, and nobody in the Reich has the faintest idea it's happening. This is the story of one night that changed a war, and of the phone call that stunned a supreme commander, humiliated the most methodical general in the British Army, and proved once and for all that audacity, when wielded by someone who genuinely doesn't care about the rulebook, can do what months of careful preparation cannot. Welcome back to World War II Tales, and if you're new here, stick around. This is exactly the kind of story we live for. A river unlike any other. Before we get to the generals and the boats and the phone calls, you need to understand what the Rhine actually meant. Not just militarily, but in the bones of European history. The Rhine is not simply a river. It is 820 miles long, rising in the Swiss Alps and draining into the North Sea. And for more than 2,000 years, it served as the physical edge of civilization, as the Romans understood it. Julius Caesar crossed it in 55 BCE, and then again in 53 BCE, not because he needed to militarily, but because doing so was a statement, a demonstration that Rome could reach beyond the known world and come back again. The Romans built their fortress legions along this bank. They looked east across the water at the Germanic tribes and decided that some boundaries were better left as boundaries. After the Romans pulled back, the Rhine became something even more powerful in the German imagination. A homeland river, a sacred border, a symbol of the nation's very identity. In 1840, a poet named Max Schneckenburger wrote a patriotic anthem called Die Wacht am Rhein, The Watch on the Rhine. It became the rousing anthem of German armies for generations. The river wasn't just water. It was mythology. It was belonging. It was the thing you defended when everything else had already been lost. By March 1945, it was also Germany's last major natural barrier on the Western Front. The Germans had blown up almost every bridge across the Rhine. Railway bridges, road bridges, the ancient spans that had stood for centuries. They had fortified the eastern bank. They had positioned artillery in the hills above the water. German war planners had spent months drawing up scenarios for every conceivable Allied crossing attempt, gaming out responses to attacks at Wesel, at Cologne, at Düsseldorf, at Ries. They knew the Allies were coming across the Rhine eventually. The question was where. They did not even bother to seriously plan for Oppenheim. It barely appeared on their priority list. It was a small wine town on the western bank, about 12 miles south of Mainz, with low, flat banks, a manageable current, and the Rhine here ran no more than 1,000 feet wide. The German garrison in this sector consisted largely of Volkssturm, the late-war militia of factory workers and elderly men handed bolt-action rifles and told to defend the fatherland. There was also the small matter of one more thing the Germans didn't know yet. The Americans had been quietly planning this crossing for weeks, which is precisely why George Patton chose it. The two men who couldn't stand each other. To understand what happened on the night of March 22nd, you need to understand the two men whose rivalry made it almost inevitable. In the north, commanding the British 21st Army Group, stood Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. He was a small man, precise and vain, teetotal and non-smoking, deeply religious in his way, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. Montgomery had rebuilt the shattered British Eighth Army after the disasters of the Desert War, and led it to victory at El Alamein in 1942. He had commanded the ground forces on D-Day. He was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished soldiers of the entire conflict. He was also, by nearly universal agreement among the American generals who served alongside him, extraordinarily difficult to work with. His planning style was methodical to a degree that sometimes crossed into caution. He refused to move until everything was prepared. He would not attack until he had air superiority, artillery dominance, secure supply lines, rehearsed troops, and numerical advantage. Eisenhower himself reportedly said privately, and this is documented through aides' recollections and post-war biographies, that Montgomery was the only man in either army he simply could not get along with. For 6 weeks in February and March 1945, Montgomery had been preparing Operation Plunder, the great set-piece crossing of the Rhine that he intended to be the war's decisive blow. The scale was staggering, more than 1 million men from 3 nationalities, roughly 4,000 artillery pieces, 36 Royal Navy landing craft transported overland from the English Channel, a massive smokescreen that had been running since March 16th to hide the preparations from German reconnaissance. And on the morning of March 24th, the day after the assault, 14,000 paratroopers dropping east of the Rhine in Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation ever executed. Montgomery intended to cross the Rhine at Wessel on the night of March 23rd. The whole world knew it was coming. The Germans knew it was coming. There was no particular secret about it, nor could there be, given the sheer logistics of moving over 1 million men and thousands of guns into position. The logic was that such overwhelming force would simply smash through, and Montgomery was going to be the man who cracked Germany open. 300 miles to the south, reading the same maps with very different eyes, was Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., 60 years old, thinning silver hair, a high, reedy voice that surprised everyone who met him because it didn't match the swaggering image at all. 2 ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, a lacquered helmet that gleamed like he was heading to a parade. He prayed every morning and swore magnificently every afternoon. He had been wounded in World War I and came back. He had been suspended from command after slapping a hospitalized soldier in Sicily in 1943, and fought his way back from that too. He had led the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, racing across France. He had wheeled his entire army 90 degrees north during the Battle of the Bulge to relieve the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, a pivot that military historians still study as a masterpiece of rapid redeployment. Patton believed, without irony, that he had lived past lives as a Roman legionary and as a Napoleonic cavalryman. He called the Third Army the finest in the world. He had been told in measured diplomatic language that his role in the coming Rhine offensive would be secondary. He would cross when he was ready, after the main effort in the north had been launched. He had absolutely no intention of waiting. Bradley's phone call. The moment that set everything in motion came on, or around March 19, 1945, 4 days before Montgomery's scheduled crossing. General Omar Bradley commanded the 12th Army Group, which meant he was Patton's direct superior. Bradley was a Missouri farmer's son with a mild face and soft-spoken manner that concealed a fierce competitive streak and deep loyalty to American military interests. According to the official Army history and Bradley's own memoir, Patton received orders to take the Rhine on the run, to cross at Mainz when the opportunity arose. The key detail that has been debated ever since is how explicit that permission actually was, and how much the timing was Patton's own initiative. What we know for certain, Bradley's memoir confirms he encouraged Patton to cross before Montgomery. The official United States Army history confirms that Bradley specifically told Patton to take the Rhine on the run. What remains murkier is whether Eisenhower formally knew what was being planned in the days leading up to the crossing. The official record says Eisenhower was surprised. Bradley's memoir suggests otherwise. Patton's own diary is conspicuously blank for the days immediately preceding the operation, which, given what we know of Patton, suggests there may have been things he preferred not to commit to paper at the time. Senior commanders in coalition warfare sometimes choose not to formally know things that give them useful deniability, and the circumstantial evidence points to the possibility that everyone involved understood exactly what was being set in motion, even if nobody said so in writing. What is not in dispute is that once Patton had his green light, he began moving immediately. What is also not in dispute is that Patton had been looking for this moment his entire career. He had studied the Rhine crossings of history. He knew that Julius Caesar had built his famous bridge across the Rhine. He knew that no invading army had made a successful assault crossing of the Rhine since Napoleon's era, making this the first such crossing in 140 years. He wanted his name next to those names. He wanted his Third Army to be the force that broke through Germany's last wall. And he had a plan: finding the perfect gap. Patton's engineers and staff had been evaluating the Rhine's western bank for weeks, with very specific criteria. They were not looking for the obvious places, the historical crossing points, the obvious fords, the places with rail connections and road bridges. The obvious places were where the Germans were looking. They wanted somewhere nobody was watching. They settled on a two-town stretch, Oppenheim and nearby Nierstein, about 12 miles south of Mainz. The eastern bank here was low and relatively flat, good for getting troops ashore quickly. The current at this point was manageable, and the Rhine was no more than 1,000 feet wide at this stretch. The 5th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Red Diamond Division, was assigned the crossing under Major General S. Leroy Irwin. They were veterans of more than 20 river crossings in France and Germany, battle-hardened troops who understood how this kind of operation worked. When General Manton Eddy of 12th Corps told General Irwin that Patton wanted the crossing done that very night, on March 22nd, Irwin initially protested that a well-planned and ordered crossing wasn't possible in that time. He then added that he could get some troops across. That was enough for Patton. Meanwhile, the Allied deception machinery had been working. American radio traffic mimicked a build-up for a northern crossing. Every fragment of intelligence reaching Berlin pointed to one conclusion. The next great Allied effort would come at Wesel at Cologne, perhaps Dusseldorf. Not here, not among the vineyards and wine towns of the central Rhine, not at a crossing point that barely appeared on German priority defense lists. The trap was set, and on the afternoon of March 22nd, the assault boats began moving into position. The silent assault, the preparation for the crossing, was a study in deliberate deception. Pontoon sections and bridging equipment had been distributed among ordinary supply convoys, covered in tarpaulins, mixed in with rations and ammunition and motor pool spare parts. A German reconnaissance pilot flying overhead would have seen nothing unusual, just the same gray streams of logistics trucks rolling east. The components were all there, staged near the river, simply invisible. By 1900 hours on March 22nd, soldiers of the 5th Infantry Division's 11th Infantry Regiment were receiving their final briefings. The instructions were whispered. No fires, no talking above a murmur, no smoking. The crossing would begin at 2200 hours, 10 o'clock at night. Assault boats would be carried to the riverbank, not driven. The first portions of the crossing would be paddled in silence. At 2200, the order went down the line, passed man to man in a whisper that traveled like wind through grass. The boats slid into the current. What they found on the other side was almost anticlimactic. The German defenders in this sector were a shadow of what a defense force should have been. The men waiting on the far bank were largely Volkssturm, elderly factory workers drafted in the desperate winter of 1944, and handed bolt-action rifles, assigned to hold the Rhine with almost no artillery, no reserves, and no means of calling for rapid reinforcement. The crossing met almost no serious resistance. By 0200 hours on the morning of March 23rd, the entire 11th Infantry Regiment was across the Rhine. The 10th Infantry followed. By 0600, 6 full battalions of American soldiers stood on the eastern bank of Hitler's sacred river, dug in and listening for a counterattack that never came. General Bradley's memoir later recorded total casualties for the assault crossing at 34 dead and wounded, extraordinarily light for 6 battalions, crossing a major defended river at night. By any standard, that number borders on miraculous. And at that point, the second challenge began. Getting a bridge across the Rhine before daylight exposed the operation to German air attack. The bridge that shouldn't have been possible. The unit tasked with building the pontoon bridge across the Rhine at Nierstein, adjacent to Oppenheim, was the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, part of the 1135th Engineer Combat Group under 12th Corps. Their assignment: construct a 366-meter floating bridge, roughly 1,200 feet, across a moving river, under combat conditions in darkness, as fast as humanly possible. The memorial plaque erected at the crossing site in 2017, attended by the last living veteran of the operation, records that the bridge was completed in 18 hours. The Stars and Stripes reported in 2017 that engineers did it with the enemy only 400 yards away, and under orders that no noise was permitted. To put that in perspective, a 1,200-foot tactical pontoon bridge across the Rhine in 18 hours, in darkness, under the threat of German artillery and aircraft, was a remarkable engineering achievement by any measure. And they did it while simultaneously ferrying infantry across in assault boats. Robert Shalado, the last living veteran of the Nierstein crossing, recounted at the dedication ceremony that it was a race against dawn and against German discovery in equal measure. Every section of that bridge was laid with the knowledge that if German air found them before they finished, everything would be exposed. German artillery did find them during the construction, scattered shells that fell in the vineyards and around the riverbank, but failed to score direct hits on the bridge itself. German aircraft also appeared and were driven off by American anti-aircraft batteries pre-positioned on the western bank. The bridge survived intact. By the time the sun rose on March 23rd, the 249th had done what they set out to do. The bridge at Nierstein was open. Tanks began rolling across it. American armor was on the eastern bank of the Rhine. An invading army had made an assault crossing of Hitler's sacred river in the manner of Napoleon, and had then immediately built a road behind itself. It was the fastest major assault crossing of the Rhine in the war. What Eisenhower said. The phone call that would be debated in military circles for decades happened on the morning of March 23rd. Patton called Bradley first. The conversation is documented in multiple sources, including Bradley's memoir, A Soldier's Story. Patton's voice on the secure line was deliberately low-key, almost conspiratorial. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across. I sneaked a division over last night, but there are so few Krauts around there they don't know it yet. So, don't make any announcement. We'll see how it goes." Bradley's response, by his own account, was, "Well, I'll be damned. You mean across the Rhine?" "Sure am," Patton replied. "I sneaked a division over last night." The news made its way north to Eisenhower's headquarters. arriving first as fragmentary reports about unusual Third Army activity near Oppenheim. Eisenhower received the confirmation through Bradley. Multiple accounts from aides who were present describe Eisenhower as outwardly calm, but clearly taken aback, putting down his cigarette, picking it up, and according to those present in the room, responding to the news that Montgomery didn't yet know with a profanity. Exactly what Eisenhower said in that moment has been retold in various forms across multiple memoirs, but the picture is consistent. Surprise, followed by the immediate calculation of political consequences. On March 23rd, Eisenhower wrote Patton a warm letter acknowledging his accomplishment and praising the Third Army's performance. Publicly, though, Eisenhower was measured and careful. He could not celebrate too loudly. Montgomery was British. Britain was an ally. The coalition that Eisenhower had spent 2 years holding together at enormous personal cost needed maintenance. If Eisenhower had stood up and publicly declared that Patton's improvised night crossing had achieved more than Montgomery's painstaking million-man assault, it would have been diplomatically ruinous. In private conversations recorded by aides and revealed through post-war memoirs and biographies, it has been reported that Eisenhower called Patton's crossing one of the most brilliant tactical maneuvers of the European campaign. Whether those exact words were used is difficult to verify definitively. They come to us filtered through aides' recollections years later, but they are consistent with Eisenhower's documented admiration for the achievement and his private correspondence. He never made the sentiment public. Given the political realities of coalition command, he couldn't. Later that same day, when the Germans had discovered his forces and secrecy was moot, Patton called Bradley again with very different instructions. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across," he reportedly said. "I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." Bradley obliged. The press release went out, and by the time Montgomery's massive artillery preparation began thundering on the night of March 23rd, American newspapers already had a story dated the previous evening that was making Montgomery's crossing look like it was playing catch-up. The theatrical general on the bridge. On March 24, 1945, 2 days after the crossing, Patton arrived at the Oppenheim pontoon bridge. His memoir records that he and his aides crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, stopping to spit in the river. His aide, Colonel Charles Codman, who was present, gives a rather fuller account in his own memoir. Codman writes that Patton led the little procession casually across the bridge, stopping halfway. "Time for a short halt," Patton reportedly said. Walking to the bridge's edge, he surveyed the slow-moving surface of the river. Then, according to Codman, without further comment, he unbuttoned his trousers and relieved himself into the Rhine. "I have been looking forward to this," Patton reportedly said, a line that has been quoted in various forms across multiple accounts of the moment. In Patton's own memoir, he wrote that they stopped to spit in the river. Whether this was a deliberate bottlerization for publication, a conflation with another moment, or simply his preferred recounting, is one of history's small ambiguities. Codman's account is the more detailed and specific of the two, and the famous photograph taken on the bridge, along with the telegram Patton sent to Eisenhower afterward, strongly corroborates that something considerably more dramatic than spitting occurred. That evening, Patton sent a communiqué to General Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters that read, "Dear SHAEF, I have just pissed into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." It was pure Patton. Crossing the river that symbolized the final barrier of Germany, achieving something Napoleon had done and Caesar before him, having it photographed for posterity, and his commentary to his supreme commander was a request for fuel. The man contained multitudes. He had also, reportedly, deliberately refrained from using the bathroom that morning so he would have a full bladder ready for the occasion. Whether that detail is entirely accurate or has grown in the retelling across 80 years of anecdote, it fits the man well enough that historians have largely stopped arguing about it. When he reached the eastern bank, Patton stepped out, scooped 2 handfuls of German soil from the ground, and said, "Thus, William the Conqueror." It was a deliberate reference to the Norman king who famously stumbled and fell when landing in England in 1066, then turned the bad omen into a symbol of possession, claiming the land in his hands. Patton, who had studied military history all his life and believed he was living it, was making himself part of the story he had always meant to inhabit, Montgomery's fury and the contrast that defined the war. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was conducting final preparations for Operation Plunder. He did not know, could not yet know, that an American general had already crossed the Rhine 34 hours ahead of him. When he found out, the fury was contained, but absolute, and the contrast between the 2 operations would become one of the most discussed comparisons in the history of the Second World War. Operation Plunder launched on the night of March 23rd, and it proceeded by all measurable military standards brilliantly. Roughly 4,000 Allied artillery pieces fired for 4 hours in a bombardment that shook the ground for miles. The crossings at Rhine, Wesel, and south of the Lippe River went largely to plan. On March 24th, Operation Varsity dropped 14,000 paratroopers east of the Rhine, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. German resistance, while stiffer than at Oppenheim, was ultimately overwhelmed. But Operation Plunder cost 6,781 Allied casualties. On March 24th alone, 1,111 Allied soldiers were killed. The worst single day for Allied airborne troops of the entire war. And by the time Plunder launched, Patton's engineers already had a bridge across the Rhine. Armored vehicles were already rolling east, and the headlines in American newspapers were already written. The contrast was stark, and it was real. Patton had crossed with minimal preparation against a depleted German sector, accepting risk in exchange for speed, and suffered around 34 casualties in the initial assault. Montgomery had crossed after weeks of meticulous planning against organized resistance, including the German 1st Parachute Army in the north, and suffered nearly 200 times that number of casualties. Both crossings succeeded. Both achieved their objectives, but they represented fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. And in the war of headlines, Patton won decisively. The British Broadcasting Corporation added an unintentionally comic footnote. According to Patton's own memoir, Churchill had reportedly written a congratulatory speech praising Montgomery for the first assault crossing of the Rhine in modern history. And through what Patton described as some error on the part of the British Broadcasting Company, the speech was broadcast before anyone checked whether it was still true. By the time it aired, Patton had been across for 36 hours. Whether this story is precisely accurate in its details, or whether Patton is telling it with the usual self-congratulatory embellishment of a victorious general, is hard to say with certainty at this distance. But it has the ring of something that at least partially happened, and it became part of the legend. Montgomery never forgave being upstaged. His memoirs, published after the war, devoted substantial space to Operation Plunder, and mentioned Oppenheim in a single sentence, characterizing it as a crossing of minor tactical significance. Military historians have disagreed with that characterization ever since. The collapse of Germany's Central Front. What followed the Oppenheim crossing was not so much a battle as a dissolution. Kesselring threw what he had at the bridgehead. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had defended Italy for 18 months against Allied invasions and had been commander-in-chief of the Western Front for only 11 days at this point, asked his staff what reserves could reach Oppenheim to seal the bridgehead. The answer was almost nothing. There were perhaps 60 tanks from remnants of the 11th Panzer Division, roughly 30 miles away with limited fuel and ammunition for only 1 or 2 engagements. 18 artillery pieces of mixed calibers with no unified fire control, no meaningful air support. The Luftwaffe that had once darkened European skies was scattered remnants by March 1945, with pilots flying obsolete planes on minimal fuel. The mathematics were brutal. To destroy a defended bridgehead typically requires 3-to-1 superiority. The Americans had 6 battalions across, and were reinforcing by the hour. Kesselring had almost nothing. He attacked anyway because that is what soldiers do when there is nothing left to do but attack. The German armor rolled toward American lines. American artillery, not 18 guns, but over 100 guns from division and corps artillery combined, opened fire with full air observation. P-47 Thunderbolts dove on the scattered panzers. None of the German tanks reached the bridge. The Luftwaffe sent what aircraft it could scrape together, roughly 15 fighters and fighter-bombers, to destroy the bridge from the air. American anti-aircraft guns on both banks drove them back. The bridge stood intact. Kesselring sent a message to Hitler recommending withdrawal to prepared positions east of the Rhine. Hitler's response was 4 words: hold at all costs. There was nothing left to hold with. By March 26th, 18,000 American soldiers had crossed at Oppenheim and Nierstein. By late March, an entire armored division was rolling east. By March 28th, the bridgehead was 30 miles deep. German resistance in the Central Front didn't just break, it collapsed. Entire divisions surrendered. Command structures ceased to function. Patton's Third Army took Frankfurt on March 29th. They reached Nuremberg in early April. By mid-April, they were in Bavaria. The drive from the Rhine to the Austrian border took fewer than 4 weeks. Compare that to the 8 months it had taken to fight from Normandy to the Rhine. Through the hedgerows of Normandy, the Siegfried Line, the Hürtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge, 8 months to reach the river, then 4 weeks to cross Germany and end it. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, less than 7 weeks after Patton crossed the Rhine in silence. What Eisenhower actually thought, and why he couldn't say it here, is the nuance that often gets lost in the dramatic retelling of these events. Dwight Eisenhower was a more complicated figure in all of this than a simple story of surprise and admiration suggests. He had written Patton a warm letter on March 23rd. He had acknowledged the achievement, but the political reality Eisenhower navigated was genuinely treacherous. Montgomery commanded the British 21st Army Group. Churchill was invested in British military prestige in the war. The relationship between American and British commanders was already strained by months of competition over resources, strategy, and credit. If Eisenhower had publicly proclaimed that Patton's improvised rush across the Rhine had outdone Montgomery's carefully prepared operation, the diplomatic fallout within the alliance would have been serious. So, publicly, Eisenhower was measured. He acknowledged both crossings. He credited both operations. He managed the fallout with the same exhausted diplomatic skill he had brought to every major dispute within the alliance since 1942. And privately, multiple post-war accounts from aides and staff suggest he understood exactly what he had witnessed. The consistency of those accounts across different memoirs, different people, different decades, points toward the conclusion that Eisenhower recognized Patton's crossing as one of the most tactically brilliant moves of the entire European campaign. He smoked 4 packs of Camels a day. The Rhine crossing probably contributed to a few of them. The men nobody remembers, George Patton gets the headlines. He always did, and he worked hard to make sure of it. But the men who made the Oppenheim and Nierstein crossings strategically decisive were the soldiers of the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, who built a 366-meter pontoon bridge across the Rhine in 18 hours, while under artillery fire, and the threat of air attack with the enemy 400 yards away, in conditions that made every minute count. Their commanding officer, and the men who led the specific construction, are not household names. The veteran, Robert Shalato, who attended the 2017 dedication of the memorial at Nierstein, and gave an account of building that bridge as the last surviving member of the crossing, is not a figure remembered in popular history. He was there. He helped build it. He remembered what it felt like. The 5th Infantry Division soldiers who paddled across in the darkness and found 7 old men warming themselves at a fire. They went home eventually, and their stories mostly stayed with them or died with them. That's how most history actually works. The generals write the memoirs and hold the press conferences. The sergeants and the engineers build the bridges and cross the rivers, and mostly don't talk about it at dinner 30 years later. The memorial at Nierstein, dedicated in 2017, stands at the exact spot where the first boat landed. It commemorates the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion by name. Helen Patton, the general's granddaughter, attended the ceremony alongside Catherine Rommel, the granddaughter of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in a gathering that had a certain remarkable quality to it. The descendants of 2 opposing commanders standing together at the place where one of the war's decisive moments unfolded. The plaque reads, in part, "This remarkable engineering accomplishment undoubtedly contributed to the shortening of the war, thus saving countless lives on both sides of the conflict." Simple language for an extraordinary thing. The lesson that outlasted the war. There is a reason military historians return to Oppenheim again and again. And it is not simply the drama of the night crossing or Patton's theatrical gesture on the bridge. It is what the crossing revealed about the relationship between doctrine and initiative. The Germans had prepared for months to defend the Rhine. They had mapped every crossing point, fortified every obvious approach, positioned forces in depth at the most likely locations. They had done everything right according to doctrine, according to calculation, according to the accumulated wisdom of military planning. And they lost to an approach nobody was watching, at a place that barely appeared on their priority lists. The Allied doctrine said an opposed Rhine crossing required artillery preparation, air superiority, naval support, rehearsed timetables, weeks of buildup. Montgomery's approach followed that doctrine, and it succeeded at cost. Patton's approach discarded the doctrine, and it succeeded at almost no cost. The difference was not that one approach was right and one was wrong. The difference was that Patton understood the doctrine well enough to know which parts of it could be discarded in specific circumstances, when surprise was achievable, when the enemy was depleted, when speed mattered more than safety. He didn't ignore the rules. He understood them deeply enough to know when the rules were the obstacle. That lesson echoed beyond the Rhine. The techniques used by the 249th Engineers, the concurrent work teams, the pre-positioning of bridge equipment among supply convoys, the speed calculations that made 18 hours look like the baseline rather than the ceiling, became standard practice. American engineers built bridges faster in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf, partly because the men at Nierstein had demonstrated what was possible. Patton himself was killed not in battle, but by a car accident on December 9, 1945, on a road near Mannheim, 7 months after the victory he had done so much to achieve. He was riding in his 1938 Cadillac staff car, heading to a pheasant hunt, when it struck a United States Army truck at a road junction. The collision broke his neck. He was taken to the United States Army Hospital in Heidelberg, where he was told he would never ride a horse again or lead any kind of normal life. His reported response was, "This is a hell of a way to die." He died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident, from a blood clot, paralyzed from the neck down at age 60. He was buried on Christmas Eve at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, among the soldiers of the Third Army who had fallen at the Battle of the Bulge. At his request, Montgomery lived until 1976, carrying his resentment right to the end. His memoirs gave Oppenheim one sentence. Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States and served 2 terms. He managed in public to be as measured about the Rhine crossing as he had been in March 1945. The Rhine still runs through Oppenheim. The vineyards still climb the eastern bank. At Nierstein, there is now a monument, granite and bronze, marking the exact spot where the first boat landed. It has German flags flanking it. It gives the date, the unit, and a description of what happened. The quietest possible marker for one of the war's most audacious moments. But it names the right people, the engineers who built the bridge. That seems right. That's going to do it for this one. If this story is new to you, I hope it gave you something to think about, not just the drama of the crossing, but the deeper point underneath it. That sometimes the person who changes the course of history is the one who set down the manual and asked how fast they could actually go. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps get these stories out to more people who love history. And if you're not already subscribed to World War II Tales, now is a great time to fix that. We cover the Second World War from every angle, from the strategic decisions made in oak-paneled headquarters to the individual soldiers carrying boats toward rivers nobody was watching. Hit subscribe, leave a comment about which part of this story surprised you most, and we'll see you in the next one.